great pleasure to have with us this evening Professor Marya Schechtman, who is LAS Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she is also a member of the Laboratory of Integrative Neuroscience. To anyone familiar with the theme of personal identity, Marya has been well known since the publication of her first book on this, The Constitution of Selves, from 1996, and indeed perhaps for even longer than that, since the publication in the Journal of Philosophy of her paper, Personhood and Personal Identity. That's certainly the first time I found out about her. And she has followed that up with two others, Staying Alive and The Self, A Very Short Introduction, which came out with OUP this year. Marya, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation, and to everyone who made this happen. And thanks so much to all of you for being here. It's really a terrific honor to be here giving this lecture. So the talk that I'm going to give today is really a reflection on three questions that I've been thinking about for a little while now, three interrelated questions. And the first of them is, why do people care so much about connecting to their pasts through memories? And here I'm thinking of what is behind the drive to keep scrapbooks, mementos, take photographs and pull them out in their albums and so on, to revisit your old haunts, to drive by the house where you grew up and see if the people will let you come in and look around. What's behind that? What is it doing for us? And of course, not everybody has this drive. There are some people who are just perfectly happy to let the past be in the past. They don't think about it. They don't keep scrapbooks. They're not nostalgic that way. But it does seem that cross-culturally and over time, this is a very widespread kind of drive among people. And it may seem that it's obvious, but it's really hard to articulate what it's all about, or at least I've found it so. The second question is what, if anything, this has to do with the idea that our memories make us who we are. So as you heard in the introduction, I've worked a long time on the philosophy of personal identity. And this idea that memory makes us who we are, it constitutes our identity, is, again, it's something that's extremely widespread. So just to give you a few examples here, I have John Locke. He's who's associated most maybe with this idea in philosophy, rightly or wrongly. We've got Julian Barnes saying that memory is identity, right? You are what you've done, and if you forget your life, you cease to be even before your death. Conway and Plato Pierce are in cognitive neuroscience, and they say that nearly all researchers in this area consider there to be an important and strong relation between the self and autobiographical memory. And of course, we have the first Inside Out from Pixar, in which Riley, the young protagonist, is in danger of having her islands of personality collapse because she's losing her core memories, the ones that make her who she is and give her her personality. So in a lot of contexts, you can see this idea that memory makes you who you are, and something sounds right about it, but it's not straightforward to say exactly what's going on, what kinds of memories and how they make you who you are. And then finally, the last question is there an intrinsic value to connecting to the personal past? So is there something really valuable about this kind of memory or this kind of drive? Or is it just a matter of personal taste, for instance? Is it just some people are prone to nostalgia and they like that and it's important to them and that's great, and other people not so much? Is there maybe some kind of ethical reason that we should do this, right? These questions are more about the normativity of this idea, about the ethics of it. Are you doing something wrong if you don't try to hold on to your past and keep connected to it in this way? Or on the contrary, is it destructive to do so? We value these things, but we shouldn't, right? Holding on to the past is just holding on to a lot of baggage. So these are the questions that I want to talk about today, and as you'll see, that they're very interconnected. And as you've probably already guessed from these questions, they're all also extremely complex and not very precise. None of these questions that I'm asking today, I think, has a single or monolithic or straightforward answer. I'm not going to answer them today, sorry, and I'm not going to tell you, exactly how they all fit together and tie it up with a tidy bow. But what I do hope to do by thinking about them and talking about their interconnection is to give an overall sense of the complexity and the richness of these issues, and one which will allow us to gain some insights into each of these topics and maybe to formulate some more specific and focused questions than these on which we can make some headway. So I'm going to begin by looking at what I call treasured memories. And these are basically, it's a pretty amorphous class, but it's the sort of thing that I was talking about in the first question, the kinds of memories that we're supposed to hold on to, that we keep in scrapbooks and photographs and social media and so on. And I'm going to try to get clearer on what these memories are and some of the reasons that people value them so much. And while I think there are a lot of different reasons why people might value them, I'm going to focus on one set of features which these memories share with a larger class of memories that I'm going to call immersive memories. And they're a subset of this larger class that I'm going to call immersive memories. And I'll say what that is a little later on, but you can guess from the name, they're the kind of memories where you're really sort of reliving in a very rich way the past. And I'm going to suggest that immersive memories are important because of their role in generating and maintaining a strong sense of personal identity. So I'm going to give a qualified affirmative answer to that second question about whether the value that we place on these memories and these connections to the past is connected to personal identity. I do think that that is one source of value. Then I'll look at a tradition that questions this value, saying, well, maybe we do value it, but we shouldn't. Again, I'm going to have to look at this very briefly, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what this challenge is like. And what I basically conclude, perhaps very unsurprisingly, is that there's wisdom to be found in both the idea that a strong sense of oneself over time, or a strong sense of personal identity and connection to the past is valuable, and in the idea that it can be painful or destructive. These are two huge currents of human thought over history, and unsurprisingly, there's something right in each of them. And I think some of the sense that there's a dispute here, that these are inconsistent, comes from individual differences. And I think philosophers don't always pay enough attention to personal individual differences and how important they can be. Some of it comes from talking past one another. There are healthy and unhealthy ways to connect to the past, and sometimes one position will focus more on one and one on the other. And I'm certainly not going to resolve this issue, but I think when we consider this challenge, we learn a lot of things. And one of the things we learn is that we need to be careful about broad generalities about what makes for a full, rich, meaningful human life. I used to spend a lot of time saying you need this and that and this other sense of self to be fully human, to live a full human life. And I have gained a lot of humility about that the more that I've delved into these issues. And I also think that when we look at this challenge, we can see that there might be ethical reasons both to maintain a strong connection to the past and to distance yourself from the past, and that really moving forward involves not trying to, sort of take this question head on, but to just look more carefully at different ways in which we have a pull towards one or the other. And so what I'm going to conclude with is looking at one value, just as an example of the way we can have a more focused kind of look at sub-questions. One kind of value, the sense of identity generated by immersive memories, one reason it has ethical value. And so I'm going to describe this ethical value, and it's not to say, and therefore we should all maintain strong connections to our past, but instead to say, this is the way we can start looking at these questions. We can look more specifically, what do we get from each way of dealing with our pasts, and what are the costs and benefits and the trade-offs. So as you can probably already guess from the density of prose on this slide, this is going to be a kind of windy path at times through my talk, but I promise you it is a path, and I will keep on it, and I will try to guide you wisely through it, and I will try to show you that it really is a path. So I'm going to start by talking about treasured memories. And I think, I got interested in this question because it just became very clear to me that people are always talking about memories as if they're bits of gold or something, right? They're timeless treasures of the heart. You can find millions of these things, right, if you look on Google Images. Your memories are your treasures. Hold on to them. They're your best possessions. And people also say that they can't take your memories away from you, which is sadly not entirely true. But I am going to look firstly at the question, and I think that these questions are intertwined, so I'll look at them together, of what these memories are like. What kind of memories are we talking about here, and why are they so treasured? What makes them treasured? So a first naive thought is that the memories, and not an altogether wrong thought, is that the memories we treasure are memories of happy times, and that we treasure them because these are memories we relive. These are the kinds of memories we go down memory lane, we look at the photographs, we feel like we're back there again. And if they were happy times, when we go back and relive them, the reliving makes us happy. So in this view, these treasured memories really are like treasures. I've got a little bit of extra happiness now. I'm going to put it in the bank so I can pull it out later when I might need it. And this is certainly part of the idea behind treasured memories, and one reason why at least some of these memories are treasured. And many popular expressions of, your memories are your treasures and so on explain this. And I do a lot of philosophizing through song lyrics because I think there's where you can find what people really think. So here's just 3 examples for you of different genres. There's Jerome Kern in The Way You Look Tonight, where the singer is going to be buoyed later at a cold time by remembering how his dance partner looks that evening when she's all glowing. Todd Rundgren tells you that sweeter memories are the truest remedies to set your mind at ease. And from the musical Oliver, the song Who Will Buy, there's a beautiful morning and a beautiful feeling which are to be tied up with a ribbon so you can keep them at your leisure as a treasure to see when things go wrong. So that's certainly part of the story, but I think we have reason to think it's not the whole story. And one reason we have for thinking it's not the whole story is that it's well known that the affect or emotion that's elicited by a memory isn't always, in fact, often is not, the affect or emotion that we experienced at the time we're remembering. So remembering a happy time can make me miserable if things have fallen apart in a terrible way since then. And remembering painful times can bring joy if I, made it through the pain and I'm all proud and happy and glad to be on the right path. So you might say, okay, fine, then it's not the emotion of the memory, it's not necessarily memories of happy times that we want to treasure, but it's memories that make us happy when we remember them, where we're happy in the remembering. But that doesn't seem quite right either for a variety of reasons. And one is that I think memories of painful experiences that are also painful to remember can be treasured memories. People can think of them as treasures. So if you think of something like, sitting with a dying friend, a dear friend who's dying, and holding their hand in the last few hours of their life, this is probably very painful to do, and it's probably pretty painful to remember. But I think it's completely intuitive to say that that is not a memory you would part with, right? It's one that you want to hold on to, that you never want to lose. And if that's too depressing, I can go back to song lyrics. And there was a wonderful song by Paul Anka for a Kodak commercial of 1975 called The Times of Your Life, in which you were supposed to use, this is right when you used film to remember these things, and you were to remember the times of your life. And he tells you to reach out for the joy and the sorrow and put them away in your mind, because the memories are times you borrow to spend when you get to tomorrow. And he's very explicit. We want to remember the good times and the bad times and so on. So I'm not sure exactly how you feel about Paul Anka, even if you know who he is as an authority on these things. But I think that this general idea is something that is very familiar, that somehow it's not just the good things you want to remember and not just the things that are happy to remember, but all the ups and downs that you want to remember. And what I think that this shows, and what you have probably already thought to yourself as I was discussing this, is that it seems to be characteristic of these treasured memories that they're cases where remembering something in the personal past generates a complex mixture of emotions. It's not just happiness, it's not just sadness, It's not something you can really put your finger on. These are the sorts of memories that bring a wistful smile to your face, even as they bring a tear to your eye. They engender a bittersweet joy or a poignant nostalgia, and they typically involve some level of reproduction of what you were feeling during the time remembered and how you felt then, but with an overlay of other emotions that arise from your current situation, your perspective on the past, and all the things that have transpired in between. And this generates a complex, layered kind of emotion, a kind of emotion that we tend to think of as characteristically human. So, right, we value that. We value these very complex and layered emotions. And so the idea is that the deep soulful funkiness of mixed emotions is somehow more important and confers a depth on life as opposed to the sort of escapist, I just want to remember the happy stuff and I'll do it pharmaceutically if that seems to be the way to do it. So I think one thing we can say about these treasured memories is that they tend to be memories that bring about these very complex emotions. And I think we can understand them a little better and also get a better sense of their value and why we value these emotions if we ask next, what are we remembering in these treasured memories? What are they memories of? And I think they can be memories of a lot of things. So treasured memories sort of paradigmatically are memories of significant life events, especially milestones, graduations, retirements, the birth of a child, the first day of school, right? Things like that. They can be also of sort of personal, things of great personal significance that are sort of ordinary, but important to you. That perfect day when we went for a walk and found that little cafe and sat there for hours and hours, hanging out with the kids in the backyard, something like that. They can also be not of particular events at all, but of things like life phases, when the kids were young, when I was at university, when I was young, recurring events, trips to the lake, birthdays when I was growing up, things like that, when we used to go to the movies all the time. People, places, objects, right? They can have a lot of different kinds of contents, and I think that people tend to think of these memories as of specific events, but they aren't always. But what they do seem to have in common is that in addition to whatever else is being remembered, they evoke recollection of a kind of gestalt subjectivity that's associated with the contents of the memory, a way of looking at the world and the way the world was for us then. They transport us back so we not just remember the details of the event or the kind of event, but we feel, not just the emotion, but the world looks to us the way that it looked then. And so I think sort of the best way of thinking about it is that it's like remembering what it was like to be young or remembering what it was like to be head over heels in love. You can know a lot about those times, but not really remember it in the relevant sense. So what I want to think more about is what that relevant sense is. And in her essay on keeping a notebook, Joan Didion gives a very nice description of this kind of remembering. She considers why she kept journals of seemingly random events, snatches of overheard conversation, what someone was wearing at the other end of the bar or something like that. And she decides that she did it in the hopes of being able later to evoke memories of, she says, what it was like to be me. What it was to be me was always the thing I was trying to get back to. And so really, if successful, she says these journal entries would serve as portals to a past perspective on the world. And I think that is often what we're trying to do with treasured memories, to remember what was it like then? How did the world look to me? How did I move through the world? How did I feel about it? How did I engage it? And we can get a somewhat clearer sense of what this sort of memory involves by looking at a characterization Didion gives of a part of her past that she can't remember in this way, and that's her 17-year-old self. So she says, yeah, it would be very interesting to know what it feels like to sit on the river levee, drinking vodka and orange juice and listening to Les Paul and Mary Ford, but she can't. And so the parenthetical bit is the part that I'm really interested in. She says, you see, I still have the scenes, but I no longer perceive myself among those present, even though she knows very well it was herself. No longer could even improvise the dialogue. And I think the point about not being able to perceive herself among those present is an expression of this sort of idea of trying to, I don't know what the world looked like to that 17-year-old, what it was like for her that I'm trying to get at. And the point about improvising the dialogue is important for me because it shows that this kind of remembering doesn't only involve recalling what she did say, but also being able to speak with the voice of, to speak for that 17-year-old. What would it be to improvise the dialogue? It's to know what she would say, and I say not only say, but do in these sorts of circumstances. It's to bring that into the present. And when I say this, it's important to be clear that I don't mean that the remembered gestalt and associated possibilities replace those of the present wholesale, right? She's not going to be possessed by her 17-year-old self, but rather feeling that way contextualized to the present. So let me try to give another example that I hope will convey this a little bit better. And again, it's from an old movie. It's from Casablanca, and it's unfortunately blurry, that slide. And there will be spoilers, but you should have seen Casablanca by now, so sorry. So Casablanca is replete with famous lines, and among the most famous is "We'll always have Paris." And the full quote is Rick to Ilsa, "We'll always have Paris. We didn't have, we lost it until you came to Casablanca. We got it back last night." Now, if you think about it, that's a very strange claim. What does he mean they still have Paris? Actually, the Germans have Paris. They don't have Paris. They're in Casablanca at that point. And if they do now, where was it in between? What does that mean? And what's happened, of course, is that after an intense love affair in Paris, they separate with Rick believing that he had been abandoned and that she had left him, his heart broken. And as a result, he loses the idealism and hope of that earlier time and becomes the cynical, apolitical nightclub owner that we meet at the beginning of the film. That's what it means that he's lost Paris. He can't be the man he was in Paris anymore. He just isn't. And importantly, recapturing and holding on to Paris now doesn't involve going back to living the life he lived in Paris and getting back together with Ilsa and just, recreating that. That's what I mean by saying he's not just possessed, right? Having Paris means just the opposite in some sense. It means being the kind of person he was then, which is what causes him to send Ilsa off with Victor Laszlo and begin his beautiful friendship with Captain Renault, having realized, as I've been telling myself these last weeks, that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. So it's not just that he's recreated the starry-eyed lover he was in Paris. A lot of the sadder but wiser Rick remains, and we see that too. But he has reclaimed a part of himself that had been dormant, and having reclaimed it, influences how he sees the world, what he chooses to do, how he acts, all of those things. This has become part of him again. So this is a complicated memory in many ways, the one that I just described. And I won't have time to discuss some of the complications here, but if you want to talk about them in Q&A, we certainly can. One thing is that it's a spontaneous memory and not a curated one. So when I started out talking about treasured memories, it was people pressing flowers and books and putting photos in albums. This is not. Ilsa walks in, he hears as time goes by, and then he reconnects with her, and that's how this happens. I'll say a little bit more later about memories occasioned by interactions with others, but the spontaneous part is something just to keep in mind. It's also a memory that changes status. At the beginning of the film, Rick is doing everything he can to forget his affair with Ilsa, including forbidding Sam from playing as time goes by. But by the end, it's become a treasured memory again. And this is an important feature of these memories, and it's connected to the fact that I mentioned before, that they're always being updated and contextualized, right? As you recreate the past, it's in the context of the present, and that's how you get these multi-layered, complex emotions that I was talking about. So again, I'm happy to talk about these things in Q&A, but I did want to note them and acknowledge them. And also the instability of the treasured status emphasizes an important point that will bring us to immersive memories, the thing I was calling immersive memories, which is that not everything that we remember in this strong, reliving kind of way is something we treasure. I did say that we can treasure memories even if they're painful memories of painful times, but the example I gave, it's pretty clear if you're talking about, holding the hand of your dying friend, it's because you value the friendship that you value that memory. You're willing to put up with the pain because what you're remembering is something that's so valuable to you. But we can also remember things we don't value in that way. They're just painful. Times, they don't bring joy or pride because they're over. They're just bad things that happened to us, or bad things we did, or ways we were that we don't like anymore. So the question I want to turn to now is whether the value of treasured memories resides only in the fact that they're ones we want to remember, they're of things that we value, or whether there's some value in having intense emotional memories of this sort in which we see the world again as we did then, of times that we don't value in any straightforward way and that we do not really want to remember. And I think you probably won't be surprised to find that I think that there is, and it's not sort of much of a novel insight that we have reasons to remember even things that we don't like very much. But in this context, I think that seeing why and how will help get me to the next stage on my windy path. But I do want to say that the kinds of memories I think are valuable in this way are memories where, whether we like the thing that we're remembering or not, whether we value it intrinsically or not, we're transported back to the past and get that gestalt connection in a way that is contextualized in the present. And that's important because I'm not wanting to say, for instance, that PTSD is valuable because you have this intense connection to the past, because it doesn't involve the updating. It's being stuck there in a way. So why would we value these untreasured immersive memories, as I'm going to call them? I think an analogy with immersive exhibits in museums may be helpful. And now there are many, many immersive exhibits of all kinds of very nice things, and Van Gogh and that sort of thing, and water lilies. But when I first started working on this, somebody pointed out to me that what I was calling treasured memories were all of happy things, and immersive exhibits in museums are usually of horrific things. So I think I remember, if I am remembering correctly, being scared at the Imperial War Museum in some simulation or immersive exhibit of being in a bunker that was being bombed, and it was, things would rattle. So we tend to have immersive museums of wars, of the slave trade, what it's like to be in the hold of a slave boat, of the Holocaust, what it's like to be on a train going to a concentration camp, where you're supposed to be really immersed in these horrific experiences. So why? What do we hope to get out of it? Well, if we allow that it's not always just a cynical attempt to sell museum tickets to people who don't have the attention or desire to, read text next to artifacts, it's presumably because there's a sense that we're going to learn something by being immersed in these things, by experiencing them vicariously in this way, that we couldn't learn just by looking at the text and so on. And what is it? Well, it's what it's like to be in this horrible thing. And why is that important? Well, I think that the idea is what these immersive exhibits can do for us is they make it real to us that this is a thing that really happened to real human beings, and this is what it was like. This is real. Somehow the concreteness of the thing is like, humans did this, right? This is something that humans have done, and presumably in most instances, it's to try to affect what you're going to do next. Like, this is really horrible. War is bad. You don't want to do it, right? These, are really inhumane practices. You don't want to do it. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there's a Woody Guthrie Museum with a Dust Bowl immersive exhibit, right? This is what happens when the climate changes. You might want to think about it because this is what a Dust Bowl is like. So the idea is, you want to get people to be able to see the world through the eyes of people who experienced this in a way that helps them use what you can learn for that to affect their action in a very direct way. It's not through the reasoning process, but it's through, yeah, this is bad. And so I think something as similar can go on in the personal case. And Didion, again, has advice on this, saying that we're well advised to keep on nodding terms with people we used to be, whether we find them attractive company or not. Otherwise, she says they're going to come up at, at 4 a.m, bad morning, and demand to know, right, who's going to make amends to me for having forgotten me, right? Remember, and one of the people that she's worried about here is this shy, insecure person she used to be, who she's afraid is going to come back. So what she's realizing is that this is a part of me too. This is a reality for me. It's part of my experiential and behavioral repertoire. So here's a preliminary conclusion about value. Let's call the broad category that comprises treasured memories and the kinds of untreasured memories. I've just been discussing immersive memories, as I said, because of the way that they're like immersive exhibits. And my suggestion is that immersive memories as a general class are significant to us because of the way they allow us to integrate and express multiple parts of ourselves. So these parts of our past are parts of us now in these immersive memories. They're reminding us this is a part of who you are too. This is a piece of who you are. But it's a piece of who you are that gets updated and integrated with how you are now, so that it plays a somewhat different role. And so if you remember the complex mixed emotions, the idea is to say that, it's a little simple to think there's just a linear progression of your development. Bits and pieces of you come back when you least expect it, come hammering on your mind at 4 a.m., or you're surprised by joy or something like that. And so if we're complicated like that, then what these memories do is allow us to experience that. And so I think that we, maybe value treasured memories, the earlier ones, the happy ones, partly just because they make us happy or just because that's a time we value. But I think another part of their value, which they share with immersive memories, is just the way in which this form of connection to the past gives us a strong experience of ourselves as multifaceted beings, continuing, ongoing, complex beings with a complicated set of emotional and behavioral possibilities, right, with things that change, both positive and negative. And I think that experiencing ourselves as complicated beings like that makes us complicated beings like that. It gives us a new set of ways to behave. And so this is the connection to personal identity that I think you get from this, is that it gives you this sort of complicated sense of identity. So to move on before too much time passes. So that is, I think, a reason that we value this kind of memory. So it's a long, windy path, but the idea is it gives us this sense of depth and complexity, and that we contain multitudes, that we connect with human life, and it gives us a lot of possibilities for actions. But is it really valuable? So, there is, as I said before, a long tradition that holds that a deep sense of diachronic identity and strong connections to the personal past and future is just giving us illusions. It gives us a strong sense of personal identity, and that's illusory, and we'd be better off without it. Right? According to this other tradition, which is, of course, itself very multifarious, and I'm painting with a very broad brush, but according to this tradition, it would be better for us to live in the present, appreciate our present, fully be present in our lives, and that a sense of identity of the kind I'm talking about can keep us stuck in the past, anxious about the future. It's just a lot of baggage to carry around. So some Buddhist traditions make this claim. You may be familiar with it from there. Mindfulness practices more generally are about this kind of relation to the past and future. And in philosophy, for those of you who know the names, Derek Parfit and Galen Strawson have been advocates of this way of thinking about our relation to the past. So what are we going to make of this, right? So here's a challenge. Well, as I said before, I think we need to acknowledge that there are personal and cultural differences and allow that there are many ways to have a life, wisdom on both sides, that there are healthy and unhealthy ways both to connect to the personal past and to let it go, right? There are good and bad ways of doing both. So the space of considerations here is really big, and a general answer to this question, as I said, doesn't seem likely. So one thing we learn is that we should be careful, as I said at the outset, about saying that anything is necessary for full personhood or a true life, true human life or anything like that. So I say it gives us these emotions and sense of self that are characteristic of human existence, but that doesn't mean that if you don't have it, you're somehow not fully human or something like that. So where does this leave us? That was a lot of talking for leaving us nowhere. And as I said at the beginning, I think what we can do is just try to zero in on particular things that we get from connecting and things that we lose from connecting. And that's going to just be a lot of work of looking more locally. So I'm going to close by describing one potential value of immersive memory that I think is often overlooked, that has to do with its social ramifications. At least it's overlooked in philosophical discussions of this kind of thing. And I'm offering it as an example of a foray into this messy territory, right? A way to start thinking about, okay, if we're not going to answer the big question, should I connect to the past? Is it important to have a sense of personal identity? Let's look more locally at things that are pros and cons. And so this is going to be an example of value that I think that this immersive memory has, but it's going to begin with a consideration of a memory condition that initially seems to suggest that immersive memories are maybe much less important than we might think. This condition is actually one of the things that made me humble about saying what you need to be fully human or moral or anything like that. So I'll close it out with this, talking about this condition and what I think it shows us. So I'll first introduce it, and then I'll give you a twist. So severely deficient autobiographical memory syndrome, or SDEM, is a rare condition. The prevalence is estimated at about 1% to 2% of the population, in which otherwise healthy individuals are congenitally unable to remember experiences from the inside, what are called episodic memories. Those are memories with that have imagery with them and representations. So I remember that I was born in Chicago. That's something I remember about myself, but I don't remember being born in Chicago. But I not only remember that I got on the plane to come here 2 days ago, but I remember getting on the plane. I remember being there. I can think about running through I can picture the airport. So episodic memories in psychology are just these memories where you sort of replay it, relive it in your mind. And semantic memories are just memories where you know a fact. And people who have this condition have no episodic memories and never did. So they don't have amnesia. They have perfectly good semantic memories. They know their histories. They know the details. They just don't have any internal imagistic emotional memories of the kind that I was just describing. But what's interesting is that the lives of people with this condition seem perfectly full without these memories. It has very little effect whatsoever. So in a Wired magazine profile of a woman with this condition named Susie McKinnon, we get a lot of details that show this to be the case. She's in a decades-long and very happy marriage. She has a job she enjoys, friends from childhood, lots of hobbies. And all of this is true despite the fact that she cannot remember from the inside in this episodic way meeting her husband or the day they got married or a single time that they went out together. He has all these very, detailed memories. He comes from the south side of Chicago where I grew up about the parties they used to have and what she was wearing. She has none of that. She can't remember any day at work. She can't remember any time she spent with her friends. And despite all of this, no one even noticed that she had this condition until she was in her 20s. And a friend who was studying to be a nurse practitioner said, "Can I do a practice memory test on you?" And then said, "You need to go to a neurologist." So, it's very interesting. It's very difficult to sort of imagine. She and her husband take cruises together every year. She collects souvenirs on these cruises. She points out the souvenirs, but she can't remember a single vacation except for having the knowledge that she took it. So she also, and this is very important, I think, too, doesn't just function well, but she has very well-defined moral views. She is, for instance, a white woman from a conservative Catholic family. She decided the church wasn't for her. She left the church. She married a black man against her father's wishes. She had, big fights with her family about it and had very well-developed views. She has clear ideas in general about social justice and morality, about what's right and wrong, and she expresses them in her life in the same basic varieties of ways that people who do have episodic memory do. So none of that seems to be interfered with at all. But she does seem to be incapable of the kind of deep, mixed emotional recollections that I talked about when I was talking about treasured and immersive memories. And in fact, she goes to see the movie Inside Out with the person who's writing the magazine article, and she just laughs and says, "That is such an alien picture of psychology to me." She said, "I don't think I have any islands, but if I do, they're not connected to headquarters." She just thought it was hilarious. She liked the movie, but she thought it was hilarious. So she seems to provide a striking counterexample to the idea that you need a strong connection to the past of the sort I've been talking about for living an emotionally full and rich life, and I think that's true. And there are, in fact, many points within the article where the author remarks that Ms. McKinnon is lucky to be unburdened by these kinds of connections. She says, for instance, that she's oblivious to the diminishments of aging. She's in her 60s. She doesn't remember ever looking different. She can point herself out in pictures. She doesn't remember having more energy or fewer aches and pains or anything like that, more stamina. So in that way, the author says she's very lucky. And maybe she is. I don't know that it's not obvious to me that that is necessarily entirely positive, but okay, whatever. But there's another moment in the article that suggests that whatever its compensations and whatever new possibilities for value it opens up, this condition might involve the loss of something that we do tend to value. So the moment was, I was really just haunted by this moment in the article. It describes an incident that occurred when she and her husband lived in Arizona, and he went out fishing, and he got jumped by a group of men in a racially motivated attack. He came home covered in welts. She got completely hysterical. Then he got hysterical, right? It was a very traumatic incident. And as they're recounting it, he, as one does when one recounts these incidents, starts to get visibly upset. It was a horrible experience. And it says, though, that in the present, she knows the salient facts of the story, but the details and the painful associations all reside with her husband. For her, the memory doesn't trigger the same trauma and fear associated with it. She says, "I can imagine being upset and scared, but I don't remember that at all. I can't put myself back there, shades of Didion. I can only remember what it would have been like." So the interviewer again says that she's very lucky to be spared these painful memories. And in some sense, right, I guess she is lucky to be spared them. But first of all, I thought, but what about her husband, right? Is he lucky that she's spared them? And also, I think she's losing something. And I think that our discussion of treasured memories can help us say a little bit about what it is that's lost here. So I think being able to share someone's traumas and triumphs by recalling them together is a deeply important form of human interaction and one we engage in regularly. And again, it's not just this frightening or traumatic event she can't share with her husband in this way, but also significant days in their life as a couple, their history that people tend to relive together. She can't relive with him the wedding day, the vacation, or anything like that. Now, of course, it's clear that they have a good relationship. So again, the claim isn't that it's not possible to have a good relationship with someone if you can't do this. There are lots of ways in which we can relate intimately to others. But still, while she jokes that they have such a good relationship because she can't remember their fights, it seems that something important has been lost. I mean, it's at least a truism and a well-established fact there's often a deep bond that forms among people who have experienced traumatic events or difficult events together. We've been through hell together, right, is a thing that matters. We have this history together. This is well studied in veterans of combat, for instance. But it can be found in multiple everyday instances with varying degrees of, difficult event that don't have to rise to the level of trauma, right? Even if you've had a complicated upbringing and you want to get together with your siblings and rehearse, did that really happen when we were growing up? Was it really like that? Did we really do that or whatever? And so the question is, right, why? Well, I think there are many reasons for this, of course. One, and it's been widely studied and many reasons have been suggested. But one is that someone who is there with you and who can connect with that time can just understand you in a way that other people can't. They know what happened to you, and they know what you and they and the group of you were like them, how the world was for you, what you did and said in that context, how you were. And in this way, they know parts of you that others do not and perhaps cannot. And that provides a space in which to keep in touch with the reality of the parts of you, some of these parts of you, and allow you to keep on nodding terms with them, ideally in a safe space where they can be brought out, contextualized, and made part of the present in the ways we discussed before. And this kind of benefit, I think, is not only part of negative experiences, but more generally, people have known you a long time, know parts of you that might not be evident now, right? Parts of you that get, mutant or dormant and you're living and your kids think you've just always been old like this, but your friend from, school knows a part of you that they just aren't going to know and can help you to keep it alive and help you to have it reemerge. So old comrades and friends, I think, are witnesses to who someone was, and they interact with you in ways that can reawaken that can help us to reawaken those parts of ourselves. And if you just think of, the truism about how important it is to have people who knew you when, and the people who knew you when can help you in lots of ways. They can help you be grounded or humble, or they can help build your confidence because they knew you in a circumstance where you weren't having this problem. So the ability of other people to help us bring these parts of ourselves, have these sorts of memories, and for us to do it in turn back to them seems to be an important part of why we reminisce. And I may have made it sound like other people are just a means to an end of helping you have some sort of rich emotional experience or something, or have a rich memory. But that is not what I mean. I think that the emotion and sense of memory and so on are as much a means that allows you to relate to the other person as the other way around. They're just two sides of the same coin. And that wasn't very clear, but here's what I mean by that. I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about why people reminisce so much. And I think if you think of it, the kind of case where you see a friend that you haven't seen in a long time, or if you go to conferences where you see the same group of people maybe every couple months or something, one of the first things people do is reminisce. And why? Well, because you've both been off, or all been off, immersed in your other life, where you live a life that doesn't involve these people, and you're doing that. And then when you get back together, it can be awkward because you're not in the place where you know how to relate to one another in the way that you had the last time you saw each other. And rehearsing these stories together and the kind of memories that it can bring up gets you mutually into a place where you can be together in these ways. And again, there can be good or bad, healthy or unhealthy, right? I mean, think of going home, right, however old you are, to the parental home, and suddenly you're infantilized for good or for ill. But, right, it's that kind of thing that I'm thinking about. So I think there's ethical significance in these memories that's connected to the fact that in an important sense, they're not just our memories. We're holding part of other people's identities in our memories insofar as we continue to witness them, to see them, not just as who they are right now, but as the whole person they were, or as parts of them that other people don't see, and help to keep those alive. And I'll just say very quickly, because it's time to stop, but I think one way of thinking about the importance of this can be seen if we think, and once we recognize this, the way that our seeing and treating other people as the people they were, because we share these mutual memories, can awaken things in them even if they can't remember. And I'm thinking here specifically of dementia. And I have some nice examples that I can give you in Q&A. I'll just, some involve song lyrics. But there's this very nice example that Janelle Taylor, who's a philosopher, gives of when she goes to visit her mother who has dementia. And Taylor has had this just hectic week and it's horrible and she's, all burned out, and she goes to visit her mother and she's in the common room and they go upstairs to watch TV and she sort of sits there and yawns, and her mother doesn't remember who she is anymore. I mean, she can't say her name or what their relation is. But her mother looks at her and she says, "You're tired, you put your head down and rest," right? And she just says, "Come on, have a little nap." And she does. And she gets up and she says, right, "I woke up feeling so much better, deeply comforted by the fact that the mother I now take care of can still, in small but important ways, also take care of me." And I think, she still saw her as her mother, and somehow she brought that out in her so that she could behave, right, not exactly as she did, but she can help keep part of that going. So in conclusion, and I can, again, say more about that if people are interested, our identities are intrinsically bound up with the identities of others, I think, for good or for ill. And our individual identities and our ability to be together with others in deeply important ways seem to depend on mutual and individual connections to the past, right? Rick was just there being bitter, and until Ilsa came and reawakened him, that part of him was just dormant. I also like to talk about Ebenezer Scrooge here, especially this time of year, because the lights are already up, right? Until those ghosts came, who knew that part of Scrooge was still there to be reawakened? So here as elsewhere, there are varying claims and pulls, but we can see why immersive memories and strong interactions with our past could be valuable, even if it's not an unqualified value. And that's it. There's a lot of work to be done, but I hope that I've given you reason to think about doing it. So thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Marta. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. You alluded to it at some points of the presentation, but I'm really curious about your thoughts, perhaps research or maybe writings about not necessarily the impact of memories on identity, but actually the other way around. How does our identity and how it changes throughout our lives impact the memories, especially the memories are very moldable and they change throughout the lives? Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question. And the answer is maybe twofold. So mostly what I've been thinking a lot about is just how having memories of this form gives us an identity. And there's a lot of really interesting work in neuroscience that suggests that the same neural pathways are involved in this sort of intense first personal remembering, in imagining the future, and in thinking about counterfactuals, thinking I could have been, I might have done. And so that whenever we remember, it's a highly reconstructive process, but it's also very continuous with thinking about the future and about how things might have been. And so a lot of what I've done is just to think about the fact, well, maybe this is how we get a sense of ourselves as continuing in time. And when we're remembering, it's always coming with imaginings, and with it could have been different. And so that gives us a big sense of that. But I also think you're right that your understanding of who you are develops in, specifically in really interesting ways. Because your memories get updated. And so in a way, the flip side of the thing that I was talking about that was valuable is about the way in which if you interact with somebody who hasn't been around as you've been updating your sense of self and contextualizing that memory, it may bring the old thing out, but the old way of being or whatever, but it can be very bad if they won't attend to the fact that so that's what I was sort of alluding to. I was talking about going home and being infantilized. One Thanksgiving, in the US, all the kids come home from college, and I was standing behind these kids in line at a Starbucks or something, and they were saying, yeah, I know, it's so weird, you come home and, I'm in my 20s, but when my parents said, do you have a key? I'm like, you would give me a key? You're gonna trust me with a key? And so, right, this can lead to a lot of conflict if people will not pay attention to your saying, yes, I was, but not so much anymore. And then certainly, and it's a very common device in novels, but I think also happens in real life, that you learn something. It happens in Casablanca, for instance, that what he learns is that he was wrong. The way he remembered the past is not actually the way it happened, and that changes everything. So about your sense of identity, I think, yes, it's connected. You're building it out of your memories, and then as you change your memories, you have to think of it as sort of, but I think of the development as less linear and more sort of accretion. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Hi, I had two thoughts, and I wonder if I could be indulged to ask two questions. The first was about the lady who lacked that lack of experiential memory, you might call it. I wondered, did she have any children?
I don't believe she does. At least they didn't mention any children.
Right, because I would have thought that lack of being able to empathize at an emotional level would have made that quite difficult potentially.
Yeah, so here's an interesting thing. So it happens that because some stuff ends up on YouTube, and I've talked about her before, someone contacted me and gave me information that allowed me to verify that this really was someone who had been diagnosed with this condition by proper authorities, who did have children and was very worried about that. But the kids seemed to, he said, how will I know I'm a good father if I can't remember? I'm like, it won't help, believe me. You never, what's interesting is that she has a lot of empathy. Like when her husband came home, he was holding it together until but not in the memory. And I do think, I don't know. It seems...
Just in that aspect of witnessing and mirroring an emotional experience, especially with young children and their development of their sense of self. Okay, the other thing was about, you were talking about the value of the autobiographical self and memory, and then that counterposition about mindfulness and being present. And I wondered if they're really like either or. I sort of think that they relate to one another and they have purposes or functions, but they're kind of different. And in order to be really present, I would imagine that you would have to have a good sense of self in terms of your autobiographical self to then be able to be present. But the one thing that does seem to be different about the two is it's a kind of a different quality of being. I think when you're kind of really present in the moment, it's because you're not relating to yourself in the same way, in that your awareness is going out rather than thinking about yourself as an object looking back. So it's sort of a different way of being in the world, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree with you. So one thing that's complicated here is, of course, there are many different traditions of this that say different things, and I am by no means an expert on all or any of them, but I agree with you. I think the thing about the ones I do know is that, they don't want you to be, it's not about being in the present in the same way a mouse is in the present, right? It's some sort of higher level of being in the present, which requires a great deal of consciousness and a great deal of self-observation, but as I understand it, in which the sense of self is very different and plays a different role. So I think that is probably right, as best I can understand it. And I only brought it up because
I think that's about where the center is, isn't it? It's where, in the sense of, in that process of awareness, the sense of the center of that experience is somewhat different to if you're thinking about yourself.
Thank you very much. Fascinating talks. I'm quite interested in the externalizing memory, photos, journals. And you mentioned something about the treasured memories. They are spontaneous, not curated one. And I never thought of that. And upon reflection, I found it's quite true. And I just wondering, is that one of the reasons we are trying to curate in our memory by, taking those photos or writing down our diaries so we can have like a way to less spontaneous, like it just happened to me. I still remember I was 8 years old in this classroom.
Yeah, I think that's right. Right, the spontaneous ones are like you catch the whiff of perfume, or you hear that song on the radio, or like you walk outside and it's like, oh, beginning of the school year feeling because of the temperature and whatever. Or you dip your Madeleine in the tea, and then there are many pages of prose. So I think that's right. And I think it's interesting. It goes back to the question about how memory shapes identity. The ones that we choose to curate might not be the ones that later on we think, I wish I could get that one back. But I think that's exactly what Didion was saying is, I want to have like these sort of, portals there so that I can get this back. And also connected to the updating, one phenomenon that's kind of interesting is that the more you revisit memories, of course, the harder it is to get them back as they were. So if you listen to the song too much, it gets a whole bunch of new associations with it. So it doesn't feel as much like a portal to the past. So I think there's a lot of interesting work to do on the externalization, and especially now that we all carry around, cameras with unlimited memory, right? That, and the way people curate things on social media as opposed to the way they used to. But I think you're probably right, yes.
Thank you very much. I so enjoyed that. Ooh, I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about the value that you are saying is in encountering oneself as a complex person with lots of different past persons. To get a bit more grip on that idea, here's 4 things you might think you mean by that. So you might think that it's valuable to have a sense of yourself in that way because you gesture towards valuing complex emotions. And so that's a kind of experiential value. So it's valuable to experience yourself in this way. But I'm imagining that's not what you mean, because you could have that experience while it being kind of counterfactual, and then it wouldn't have the same value. Another thing is that so Léa Sallier thinks, for example, that it's good to feel like oneself, and that in order to feel like oneself, you kind of need to know what yourself feels like. So you could mean that, or I think maybe some people would think it's just good to pay yourself a certain kind of attention, and maybe it's good because it's doing that. I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent question. And in some ways, I think all of the above, plus the ability to interact with others in certain complex ways that we can only do because we have these features. And so I actually, to be completely honest, I'm a little worried about value there. I'm trying to think of what are the things that are characteristic of this and what might be some reasons why we might want this or something. So the idea is something like all of the things you say, and also it goes back again to the first question, that in some ways what I'm thinking is less about how particularly doing this and that changes me because I have this memory and so on, and more about the way in which having this awareness of different parts of ourself gives us a host of sort of cognitive and emotional and social capabilities that we wouldn't have without it. So there's something, the idea being that somehow we experience ourselves as being, more than is on the surface right now, which can give us a lot of possibilities for trying to contact or connect with other parts of ourselves, or rectify other parts of ourselves, or guard against other parts of ourselves. And so that a lot of our social and ethical interactions seem to involve this form of complexity. But exactly how that works in, when you see Susie McKinnon, who has got no problem being a moral human being, right, but just doesn't seem to do it quite that way, is something that requires more speculation, which is why I was trying to say, well, like, here's something she can't do that maybe we would value. So, yeah.
Hi. So I guess a lot of the lecture tonight kind of focused on identity as a result of an accumulation of salient memories and a lifelong accumulation of rich life experiences. What I was wondering was, in your research or in the literature, has there been a focus or exploration of identity in terms of what may be shaped from other people's perception of oneself, and also in terms of its fluidity, in terms of whether identity can be consciously manipulated in terms of time and place as the situation is convenient. Thank you.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of work on the influence of social, cultural, relational factors on identity, and of all different kinds, right? There's the sort of worries about oppressive, master narratives of what somebody like you is like, or particular narratives of you. There's also the just sort of ways in which our identities are socially constructed that can be benign or supportive as well as. And so in a way, that was sort of what the stuff at the end was supposed to be about, that, whether someone can see you, all of you, is very important. And what it's like if I just said I didn't do much with it, but what happens when your view and somebody else's view clashes, and how you adjudicate that. And there's a further thing that goes back to the what do I mean by value, because there was a question about, there's lurking behind this also a question of what it means to get it right about this is a part of you, or this is what it was like to be you then, right? It's not a kind of fact that you can get right or wrong in quite that way. So one thing I've thought about a lot is, suppose, and there are novels like this too, you and your friend have this mutual fantasy of how it was when you were younger, and you support each other in it, and it brings that out in you now. Does it matter that it's false? And if so, why and how? And I think the same thing with immersive exhibits. I was thinking about that too. Like, what if you could have this really great, war exhibit that made everybody hate, war and peace reigned on earth, but then you found out that the details were all wrong, right? Of what would that matter? And I think it does. And so then I think that just relies on the fact that you're always vulnerable to having to update in nice ways, like for Rick in Casablanca, but also in not so nice ways. I don't, it's a long range answer, but there's just a lot of stuff in what you said, so yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it. To be honest, you may have already answered this question because it actually links to the question the gentleman asked. I'm going to frame it differently in case, it brings out a different response. Because we are aware of the fact that identity is relational, and I'm thinking of memory being relational. And then about, the way then, therefore, when we think about treasured memories, I actually think whether we are actually treasuring them because we also know they are fragile. The immersive memories are fragile. The way they can get, they are open to violence, the violence of the other, the memory of the other, and how the semantic memory, when you kind of shift the facts, that you can shift the immersive memory. So I'm thinking about trauma, I'm thinking about memory, identity, collective memory, and personal memory. If possible, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, you're right. We do think that memory is fragile and we're trying to, we're both trying to protect it, but we're also trying to contextualize it as well because, right, I think that it can happen that you remember something lovely from your childhood, but from where you stand now, there's something problematic about it, that it was, based on something that was, I don't know, misogynist or whatever, and that you have this conflict because it was so nice. And so I think that there is a tension between trying to preserve and trying to update. And I think that the thing that I just said in passing about the immersive exhibits making the history real to you, like this really happened to people. I think that is one of the things we're trying to do is anchor the reality of things that happen to us. And I do always, since I'm always working on these things during the break for the winter break, I'm always working on Christmas Carol. But when Ebenezer Scrooge wakes up the next morning, he looks at the place. He's like, there's the fireplace where that ghost was, and there's the corner where that ghost was. It's all real, as if looking at these points in his apartment could prove that it really happened. But I think we do that, and I agree with you that pulling out the scrapbook and looking at this happened to me is important and also in tension with the thing I said about updating. But I think that's just an existential tension and not.
Hi, thank you for the talk today. I have a question around the impact of age and its effects on memory and identity. So for instance, as we know in neuroplasticity, after the age of 35, everything slows down. How much of our memories can it affect our identity when it comes to changing it later on in life? So let's say, for example, I'm at this talk today, I leave, and then I go away and I think I take something on board. But then how much of effect of it on my identity does it change, let's say, or to become much more eventful? What's your perspective on that?
So are you thinking because of the relatively less neuroplasticity as you get older?
For example, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, you're not as, that's a really good question. I think people do change, especially when they have memories, again, updated for them or contextualized in light of what comes later. But the reason that I'm hesitating here is just because the whole notion of identity is so mysterious, right? So I think your sense of identity can certainly change. The question of whether you actually change less in relation to what happens to you and the memories you lay down as you get older is a really great question, and I just don't actually know the answer to it. But I bet somebody does, and I bet somebody studies it.
I really loved your use of song lyrics throughout your lecture. Often songs themselves are the fundamental part of really strong immersive memories. So I was wondering if you had anything to say about why music, or just like art in general, like books, films, paintings, so often are like the basis for these immersive memories that we have.
Yeah, that is a really good question, and I actually don't have a good answer to that. I've asked different neuroscience people if they understand. So there's, smells, people understand that the olfactory connections to the brain are particular, and to more emotion-laden and primitive parts of the brain are closer. But why music so much? I think it probably, and again, this can really differ for people because it probably depends a lot on what role the music played in your life. But I've also thought that, one thing is that probably adolescence and young adulthood is a time when music is really central to a lot of people. And that's certainly a period from which people remember a lot because a lot is happening very quickly to them. And that's something that they know. But beyond that, I know that people have worked on this with smell, but I have not. I've also been trying to find out if this phenomenon occurs for people who have more global amnesia. So Susie McKinnon had semantic memory, but for people who have more global amnesia, do they ever report this experience of, I heard this song, because I have heard people who work on dementia saying more than once that at the homes they visit, the people who sort of don't remember anything, when you play music from their youth, they're just suddenly, I know that, I experience it. And what's interesting is that often it's connected with sadness. People say, oh, that makes me sad. It's music from long ago. And it's not obvious why it should. And then there are, of course, lots of great videos. If you haven't seen them, just Google Swedish ballerina dementia. Where in response, people who have, there's a ballerina who's just sitting in a chair and they turn on Swan Lake and she just suddenly, sort of. So there's something very important going on. I don't think it's completely well understood, and I am anxious to hear any thoughts people have.
Thank you. Right, this question, I guess, takes us off on a slightly different tangent. I specialize I work in AI. I'm helping organizations, people, individuals, creatives think through what on earth is it, what can it do for me, how does it change what I do and where I work. It was interesting to hear your case study about that lady who had the semantic memory but not the episodic memory. And it just strikes me that AI systems have got a lot of semantic memory, having ingested the majority of published human knowledge, but no specific episodic memory, at least not in a conscious sense. So where does this take us in terms of how does the identity, if you like, of AI systems emerge? And more importantly, how do we relate to it? And how does our identity as humanity relate to an AI identity that's coming through? Because that partnership is going to be quite instrumental in the next few years. What are your thoughts on that?
That is a wonderful question, which you are probably better able to answer than I am. One of my other go-to examples of this is just a slight divergence, and then I'll come back besides this STEM case, but something I've been fascinated by is this woman who fed her journals into Chat. She's like as an extended prompt to Chat GPT, and had long and extensive conversations with her younger self, saying, what do you think about how I ended up? Is it okay, right? you know, by the way, I can tell you it turns out okay. And, you know, she had this long conversation, and I just thought that's so interesting. Like, what is going on there? And one of the things that I find really interesting about it is, you know, the more I thought about it is, well, it's not that weird, because like the fantasy of talking to your younger self is common. She did a lot of inner child work that involved writing letters back and forth from her younger self. I learned that the chair technique in Gestalt therapy involves occupying different chairs that represent parts of yourself and having conversations with them. And so that got me to thinking, because when I had originally thought about her talking to her inner child, I'm like, well, then you figured your past self as like a different individual who you need to interview to get information from, and isn't that alienating? But then I thought, well, we do that all the time. I mean, we do a lot of that to build up our own identity. And so then I agree with you that, I mean, I hadn't thought about it, but that this case too has sort of implications for that, because she and her husband they have a perfectly good partnership. And it's all at the level of semantic memory. And of course, your AI partner can remember so many more things than you can in ways that are indeed very helpful. So, I mean, so that is you know, and your AI partner at least doesn't need to reminisce with you to get back in the place where they can do the thing that they need to do, I presume. But they do need to get to know you a little bit, or at least after 10 years, my phone finally has some idea of what I'm asking it to do. So, I mean, do you have thoughts on?
I think it's just kind of it's an emerging thing at the moment, and each of us as individuals relates to kind of, you know, technology and AI in different ways. But as it becomes more instrumental in each of our individual lives, and as we have, you know, either a co-pilot at work or a brainstorming partner, or a kind of an AI that kind of help us remember things. You know, where did I put the paint? You know, I'm just about to go to B&Q to buy some more screws. Well, it says, don't worry, you put them in the drawer second to the left. So we'll rely on these systems much more. And I think it's fascinating just to explore how we will feel about that not consciousness, that intelligence, and how it will then develop and learn and adapt to serve us better. I think it's just very much an emerging field at the moment.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. I have a question about forgetting. Borges has this wonderful story that I'm sure you know. It's about a character that can't forget anything and therefore can't think. And when I saw that Didion quote, it seemed to me for a second that it wasn't just that the memory itself was far away somehow, but it was that everything, as you mentioned later, was coming in the way. So if we imagine we have a 17-year-old Joan Didion, let's imagine that the day after that memory, we put her in a white box for a year. Probably that last memory would be much more memorable to her than, or easily able to recall than if she'd been out living the world.
I think it was all those vodka and orange juices myself. Yeah.
And so I wonder, what role does a positive idea of forgetting play in your research? You know, are there people that happily say, you know, I have a terrible memory, or those kind of ideas?
Right. So I think, I mean, that's an excellent point, because you absolutely have to forget some stuff for anything you remember to be significant or useful. Maybe not so much if you're an AI, but yeah, if you're one of us. And how that fits into the story is, I think, incredibly important. So one thing you're doing with treasured memories is selecting, and this goes back to memory and identity, you know, which are the ones that I think typify, which are the ones that are salient. And one of the things, so my account of personal identity is narrative, and I'm always trying to defend using narrative as a metaphor for identity. And I think that what we do in self-narratives, and this is connected to the thing I was saying before about the, you know, imagination, counterfactual thinking, and so on, and the reconstructive nature of memory, is is distill things, right? So in our memories, a lot of times they're not, even the ones that are episodic memories of a particular event, it turns out that they're usually not, over time very accurate to the event, but they're capturing something important, which is the gist of the event or the way the event gets updated or like what the event means to you now or what the event means. So I think that simply remembering like all the stuff is not the work of creating an identity. The work of creating an identity is taking the memories and continuing, as you do when you're reading, like, just as a novel isn't the series of events or the film the series of scenes, but how they inform one another and what emerges from the whole of it. And forgetting, in some sense of forgetting, has to be part of that story, or it's just an undifferentiated mass.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. That was really interesting. So I follow the work of Brené Brown quite a lot, and she talks about this idea that we believe the stories that we tell ourselves. So in relation to memories, I guess, is there much research on how much control we have over curating our self-image, or how much of that can be self-directed?
Well, so I think there is a lot of research on it, and it's connected to the research also about how others influence our memories and how they can, for good or ill. I think that we are always vulnerable. So I'm hesitating a little bit because there's two levels at which you might say, like, you could just get the facts really wrong and you can insist that you did something you didn't do, right? Where there's ample evidence you never did it, you didn't get that award, right? You didn't win that, whatever it was, or you didn't commit the crime you thought you did. And there you're always vulnerable in one way or another to finding out that you've made a mistake and that you're going to have to update in response to that. If it's a story about your motives or about the kind of person you are, that's way more complicated. And I think the short answer, since it would take many hours and I would still not be done, is there is a lot of research on that, and there's also a lot of disagreement on it, but it's a really interesting question.
I'm afraid we will have to make that the last question. So, Marya, thanks so much for a very illuminating talk. Thank you all very much for your questions.